everyone. Thank you for coming back to the Center for Presidential History. Thank you for coming up to the Hilltop. This is a very exciting time of the semester when, frankly, the students have a lot of work, which means we get to see them at their most stressed, which means it's nice to have an evening like this where we can come together and talk about something that isn't about late papers. So this is a particular thrill, an honor for me as the director of the center, because we just celebrated, as you know, our 10-year anniversary. And one of the things that means being alive that long, around that long, is that we have had enough time to see actual success. That is to say, our guest tonight, Dr. Greg Brew, was one of our postdocs here at SMU. And as with all of our postdocs, he went off to bigger and better things. He left us to go to a little institution called Yale, and then has decided to join the Eurasia Group as their new Iran and petroleum specialist. But we knew him back when he was working on not one but two books, in fact, which he's here to talk about. Petroleum and Progress in Iran, and the struggle for Iran. So as you can imagine, Iran and oil is on his mind quite a lot. He's going to be talking about history tonight, but he's also going to be talking about, I'm sure, answering any questions you might have about current events or what's going to happen in the future, of course. And let me just stress once more that this is really exciting when we have one of our fellows come and present their book. It feels like the culmination of everything that we're supposed to be doing and that's going right. So if you would please join me in welcoming Dr. Greg Brew.
Just going to turn myself on here. Oh, yep, you can hear me. Well, hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for making it out here tonight. And thank you, Jeff, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to the CPH and SMU for having me here. It is a thrill to be back. It is actually, I think, the first time I've been back to SMU since I left the postdoc in 2020. And it's always wonderful to be back in Dallas, so thank you all. As Jeff mentioned, I was here at SMU as a postdoc. After that, I went to Yale. But I'm currently at the Eurasia Group. I serve as Eurasia Group's Iran analyst and a member of their energy team. So I'd like to just say right off the bat that the views I'm going to express here tonight are my own. They don't represent the views of Eurasia Group, my employer. So with that out of the way, I'd like to present my topic for tonight, which is the subject of one of my books, which is currently out, Petroleum and Progress in Iran, Oil Development and the Cold War. And I'm going to be discussing the subjects of the book, its major themes, some of the more interesting elements incorporated into the book regarding oil, US-Iranian relations, and the Cold War. But I'd like to start by talking about a very specific moment in US-Iranian relations and the period covered by this book. And it's a moment in the early 1960s, particularly the period of 1961 to 1962. And I'd like to talk about a specific individual. His name is Hossein Mahdavi. He's an Iranian, or was, I should say, an Iranian economist. It's unfortunately very difficult to find photos of him, but I have his name here in case you forget what he's called. But Mahdavi was an Iranian economist, and he worked in a part of the Iranian government in the 1960s that was called the Sazman-e Barnameh, or the Plan Organization. And the Plan Organization had a very important role in Iran. The Plan Organization managed, supported, and executed Iran's national economic development plan, what was known as the Third Plan. The plan was budgeted at around $2.5 billion, and it was a very ambitious program. It aimed to essentially a national transformation of Iran's economy, from agriculture and handicrafts to major industry, urbanization, and modernization. And Mahdavi served within a division of the Plan Organization that was known as the Economic Bureau. I have their letterhead here, taken from a document from an Iranian archive. And Mahdavi worked in the Economic Bureau alongside other Iranian economists, sort of the creme de la creme of the Iranian intellectual elite. But there was something else that was very important about the Economic Bureau. And that was who Mahdavi and his colleagues worked with and alongside. Mahdavi and other Iranian economists in the Economic Bureau worked alongside American economists who came from Harvard University and other prestigious American institutions. And their mission was funded in part by the Ford Foundation, the major American philanthropic organization, through a grant to the tune of about $2 to $3 million. So the Economic Bureau was, if you like, an international effort by Iranians and Americans to support Iran's national economic development program. And this was something that obviously had a great deal of support from the government of Iran at the time, which of course was headed by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, who we have here photographed with Kennedy and McNamara. But the Economic Bureau, Pahlavi, the other sort of intellectual elite economists of Iran were also closely supported by the US government, and the Kennedy administration in particular. The Kennedy administration saw the Economic Bureau as an extremely important element in Iran's national economic development. They saw it as the main way that Iran could strengthen itself, could stabilize its internal politics, could modernize its economy, and eventually strengthen the government of the Shah, the Pahlavi government. And of course, this government was a government which the United States had helped put in place. Less than a decade before, in the events of August 1953, the famous, or perhaps infamous, coup that the CIA supported, which overthrew Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and replaced the Mossadegh government with a government led by the Shah. And the United States plan facilitated the coup for a variety of reasons. But one of the major reasons was, from a US perspective, the Shah was the figure assumed to be the best bet, the best ally, the best partner for the United States in Iran. He was also presumed to be the one individual who most successfully engineer Iran's modernization, its development, its escape from backwardness, its escape from immodernity. This was the belief of the United States government when they helped put the Shah in power in 1953. By the early 1960s, a lot of that confidence had worn away. There was a great deal of skepticism and a great deal of doubt within the US government regarding the Shah. There was, in fact, widespread belief among officials such as Robert Comer, who was an advisor both to Kennedy and also later to Johnson. There was a widespread belief that the Shah was on his last legs in the early 1960s, that his government was corrupt, that the Shah himself was an authoritarian who was too indecisive and too unwilling to reform. So the Economic Bureau, the plan organization, the Third Plan, and Pahlavi, the other Iranian economists, were seen to be an incredibly important program for Iran to modernize itself, to achieve stability. And from the point of view of Comer and others, the construction of this new elite, the support of Pahlavi and his colleagues, constituted the best and maybe the last hope of averting political chaos and the possible loss of Iran to the West. And I should stress that this is the view of many US officials in the early 1960s. They saw the Shah at this point as being in a very vulnerable, very unstable situation. And there was a great deal of hope placed on figures such as Pahlavi and the economists of the Economic Bureau that they could help turn the situation around. And for a little while in the early 60s, in 61 and 62, things seemed to be going well, right? Pahlavi and the other economists put forward the Third Plan. The Shah accepted it. He also installed a reformer as prime minister in 1961. The Shah took a very visible, very public step back from ruling Iran in 1961-62. So for a little while, individuals like Comer and Iranians like Pahlavi thought things were progressing in the right direction. However, things very quickly took a turn. In 1963, the Shah retook control of the government. He sidelined Pahlavi, the Third Plan, and the Economic Bureau, and he launched a new national economic plan, which he called the White Revolution. And the White Revolution was many things. It was a political reform program, it was a cultural invigoration, but what it was most specifically was it was an effort by the Shah to reestablish his power over the Iranian state, to eliminate key areas of political opposition to his own personal regime, and in doing so, he marginalized the Economic Bureau and the plan organization, and essentially cut it off at the knees, this new reformist spirit that had been taking hold in the early 1960s. And the interesting thing about the White Revolution is that from the point of view of many Americans, particularly US officials, members of both the Kennedy and later Johnson administrations, the White Revolution seemed to succeed. Within a few years, Iran's economy was booming. The Shah was sort of the unquestioned ruler of the country. Iran seemed to have stabilized. It seemed to have been growing wealthier. The Shah himself seemed to be growing more powerful, more assertive. He seemed to be a more stable, supportive US ally. So by the end of the 1960s, there was actually tremendous confidence in the Shah, particularly at the higher echelons of power in the United States, that Iran had turned a corner. A key element of that is Iran's booming oil production during the 1960s. The element that the Shah was able to draw upon during this period was Iran's booming oil wealth, both the production of oil and more particularly the production of oil revenues from the sale of oil on the global market. But a key aspect of this system was the fact that Iran itself did not manage its oil industry. It did not sell its own oil on the international market. Iranian oil was managed during this period by a group of Western oil corporations, many of which we are still very familiar with today. What were at the time colloquially known as the Seven Sisters managed, operated Iran's oil industry on behalf of the Shah, and returned a portion of their profits to Iran, which the Shah was then able to transform into programs of economic development, an ambitious military modernization program, and other programs that allowed him to consolidate his position. So oil and the Shah and the consolidation of his power in the 1960s were very closely linked. And from a US point of view, this development was overwhelmingly a positive one. You have officials such as the US ambassador to Iran, Armin Mayer, commenting in 1965 that to understand Iran, one must understand the Shah. He mastered the job of pulling his listless and backward people forward. Our help has assisted Iran to stand on its own feet. Now, when Mayer and others say our help, they are referring to several different things. Mayer was referring to the long-standing US support for the Shah going back to the 1940s. He is referring to the assistance offered by groups such as the Ford Foundation and Harvard University, other Americans who traveled to Iran in the 50s and 60s to support the Shah's economic development program. He is also referring to the Western oil companies, the American oil companies, that partnered with the Shah during this period and helped support the consolidation of his government and the apparent stabilization of Iran during this period. He is also, I think, not so explicitly referring to the coup of 1953. That the United States ultimately was one of the major reasons why the Shah's government even existed within Iran, and that it was able to stabilize itself. So this, of course, fed into a generally positive view from the United States' point of view of the Shah as an important ally. By the 1960s, Iran is arguably the most important US ally between Bonn and Tokyo. Iran is a apparently stable, modernizing country. It boasts the largest and most powerful military in the Middle East. It is one of the world's foremost oil producers. It is increasingly a wealthy country on its way to apparent modernization. So everything within this relationship seems to have worked out. But not everyone is satisfied. Not everyone sees this dynamic in similar rosy terms. And among the dissidents is our old friend Hossein Mahdavi. Mahdavi left Iran in 1963, embittered and discouraged by the course of the Shah's consolidation. Mahdavi had originally believed that the reforms and the development programs being inculcated within the Economic Bureau and the Plan Organization would have eventually led to political reforms and a more sustainable model for economic development. In his view, the course that was being undertaken by the Shah in the mid-1960s was not sustainable. And he pinpointed oil as the key issue. This rapid increase in oil revenues that Mahdavi notes in an article he wrote for Foreign Affairs in October of 1965, the rapid increase of revenues allowed the Shah's government to escape from apparently any kind of fiscal crisis. It didn't matter how the Shah spent his money. It didn't matter that he wasted it on military hardware or that it was frittered away by corrupt officials. So long as Iran continued to produce oil and so long as Western companies continued to sell it profitably on the oil market, then the Shah would be able to maintain his position. This also fed into a belief inside Iran that Mahdavi notes in 1965 that any kind of opposition to the Shah would not succeed. and that eventually violence would be the chosen course of action for those who wished to see political reform and perhaps even the overthrow of the Shah inside his country. Pahlavi continues to write on this subject. He's active in the 1960s within Iran's dissident student organization. He lives in the United States and then France for a time. And in 1970, he writes a sort of dry chapter in a fairly obscure volume on the economic history of the Middle East. Again, Pahlavi himself is an economist. He's something of an academic type. And he writes in this chapter that was published in 1970 that the course that Iran was on was ultimately unsustainable. That this bounty of oil wealth being produced by oil companies being used by the Shah was creating a separation between Iranian state and society. That ultimately a gulf would form between the elite supporting the Shah and the rest of the Iranian people. And this gulf would widen and widen and widen until the Shah's position became unsupportable. And in his view, this was a problem that was recurring throughout the oil-producing regions, the oil-producing countries of the world. This problem, that dependence on oil, prevented any kind of political reform, prevented any kind of real change from happening, and instead supported authoritarianism, unsustainable economic development, instability, and potentially even collapse. And he came up with a term to describe this kind of state. He called it a rentier state. And in the broader literature, the concept of a rentier state holds a great deal of significance. But what it really means, what it really conveys, is what we now refer to as a petro-state. An idea of a state or a country dependent on oil to the point that produces instability rather than sustainable economic development. So that's what my book, Petroleum and Progress, really gets at, is this idea of Iran's origins as a petro-state. And of course, Pahlavi's prediction from 1970 is eventually borne out less than a decade later. The Shah faces economic crisis. He faces political crisis by the end of the 1970s. The upheavals that lead to the revolution of 1978 and 79 are partially formed out of a fall in the price of oil in 1976-77. So oil was a fundamental part of the creation of the Iranian state under the Shah, but it was also a fundamental part of how that state collapsed amidst revolution in 1979. So that's what the book focuses on. It's the origins of the Iranian petro-state, the role of the United States in the formation of that petro-state, but not just the role of the US government, although there is, as you see, a great deal of discussion and discourse around various policies undertaken by the US government over the course of several administrations. The book also looks at other actors. It looks at American oil companies that were active in Iran during this period. It looks at American development organizations, such as the Ford Foundation and others, the World Bank, various other American NGOs that came to Iran during the 1940s through the 1960s and worked with the Shah's government on various programs of economic development. Well, what the book examines are three key themes that can be summed up as global oil, local development, and US-Iranian relations in the Cold War. So I'm going to spend the remainder of my talk today discussing those themes in slightly more detail. So global oil. What do we mean when we say global oil in this period? Well, I have a nifty map that I pulled out of a French archive, actually, that displays what the global oil economy looked like in the early 1960s. And what we have are connections between major producing regions, some of which are still very major today, the United States, the Middle East, the Far East, and Venezuela, connecting these major producing regions to the major consuming regions of the world, Western Europe, Japan, other parts of the industrial world, the United States. This was the global oil economy of the early Cold War. And the most important players in this global oil economy are the players that I mentioned before, the so-called Seven Sisters, the seven major integrated international oil companies, 5 of which were American. The remaining 2 were British and British Dutch. And these major companies, I argue in the book, operated essentially as an oligopoly. What is an oligopoly? Well, it's not a monopoly. An oligopoly is a union of producers that cooperate through both formal and informal methods to manage supply, to stabilize prices in order to mitigate destructive competition and provide security for profits. That's essentially what an oligopoly is. Other scholars have noted the companies working as an oligopoly during this period, so I am building off of something of an existing scholarship. But the reason why it's important to note that these companies cooperated mostly informally in this way is that they were very concerned about stability within this new international oil system. Stability was what the companies cared about the most. So where was this oil coming from? How did these companies have access to such fantastic reserves of petroleum? Well, they held what were known as concessions in the Middle East and Latin America, but the most important ones were in the Middle East. And these concessions were contracts, essentially, agreements between the major companies and local states, local governments. These concessions gave the companies the right to enter a country, to search for, exploit, produce, refine, transport, and market any oil they found in a particular area. So these concessions gave the companies tremendous latitude, tremendous power to produce oil in a manner that they saw fit. Over time, however, the companies came under considerable pressure from local states to share a portion of their profits. The companies, as I mentioned, were operating as an oligopoly. They were doing their best to manage the global supply of oil to avoid destructive competition and keep profits and prices high. And local governments, say the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Kuwait or Iraq, saw this happening and thought, we want a portion of that wealth. We want some of the profits that are being derived from our own sovereign resources. So you can see that over the course of this period, the late 1940s through to the early 1960s, oil states of the Middle East gain an increasing amount of revenue from the operations of these major companies. So it's not just the production of oil, it's the production of wealth from oil that features within this relationship, that features within the global oil economy. And that gets to a concept that I introduce in my book, which I flesh out, which is an important part of its argument, this concept of the dual integration of oil. So oil is being integrated in two ways in the case of Iran. Iranian oil is being integrated globally through the workings of these companies. They're moving the oil into their global marketing apparatuses. They're moving it towards demand, to meet demand elsewhere. So Iran is part of a global oil system, but oil wealth is also being locally integrated into Iran. Iran is receiving increasingly large revenues from the company's operations, and the Shah, who I have here photographed next to David Lilienthal, the Shah, as ever, looking quite dapper in a nice suit and sunglasses. The Shah was interested in using the wealth of oil to support programs, some of which I've mentioned already, to stabilize his government, to, in some cases, provide arms to support his military. The Shah was, of course, very concerned about developing Iran's military capability. But the most important use for oil wealth by the Iranian government in this time was for economic development, to support programs to industrialize Iran, to modernize its economy. And of course, economic development was a political program. It was designed to help support the Shah's government, stabilize it against threats of internal stability, but particularly threats of international pressure, the threat of communism. That was an important element in the dual integration. So this is a concept that I introduced in the book. It sort of provides the spine of the book's major chapters. How did Iran fit in this global oil system that I've described, that I've shown? Well, Iran has a very dramatic history when it comes to oil, some of which I've mentioned today. Their most important episode being the famous nationalization crisis of the early 1950s. It's described in detail in the book, but Iran's oil industry had been operated and run by a British oil company for the first half of the 20th century. The company was known as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. We know it as BP today. And foreign control over Iran's oil industry generated a tremendous amount of nationalist antagonism inside Iran. Many, many Iranians did not take too kindly to the idea of foreigners running the oil industry. So in 1951, a nationalist prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh takes the dramatic step to nationalize the oil industry, to basically kick the British out. And this causes an international crisis. which leads to the coup of '53, which I've mentioned already. But there are other elements of Iran's oil history, Iran's role in the global oil system, which I discuss in the book. One of the most important ones is Iran's role as a major founder of OPEC in 1960. By 1960, the Shah is in charge in Iran, and he nominates his oil advisor, a man by the name of Fuad Rouhani, to be OPEC's first Secretary General. And Rouhani is a very important figure in the early history of OPEC. He establishes the OPEC Secretariat. He leads OPEC in a series of very involved negotiations with the major oil companies. So the crucial element in Iran's relationship with global oil is this conflict between Iranian nationalism, the desire to control Iran's oil resources, both from nationalists like Mossadegh, but also from the Shah. The Shah himself was very interested in having a degree of control over Iranian oil. This nationalist impulse versus the material concern of earning wealth through the operations of the companies. So the companies were always there. They were the ones who were selling Iranian oil. They were really the font of wealth from which Iran was able to earn its petrodollars, if you like. And this relationship caused a great deal of friction within Iran during this period. So that friction, that conflict, runs throughout the course of the book. Also, the corollary, the local development. What is Iran doing with this oil wealth that it's earning over the course of this period? The period, by the way, that the book focuses on is 1941 to 1965. And what Iran is doing is very interesting. Iran is reaching out to a variety of international institutions, international actors, to partner on a variety of different economic development programs. The book goes into great detail regarding the World Bank. The World Bank was a very important actor in Iran, particularly in the late 1940s. Something that oil wealth can do, it's not just that oil produces wealth. It's not just that Iran is earning dollars. But dollars, oil dollars, are also very useful as collateral against loans. So Iran, by enjoying a stream of oil wealth, is also able to develop a stream of credit from institutions like the World Bank. By the end of the 1960s, the bank loans Iran something close to $650 million for various development programs. Iran is also able to use its oil wealth to draw credit from a variety of American and European financial institutions. So that's an important element of this local integration of oil. The other important element is the element of expertise. American developmentalists who are drawn to Iran or who come to Iran with ideas of how to modernize it, how to bring American technical know-how to the Iranian frontier. And one of the most important individuals who attempts to do this is David Lilienthal. Some of you may be familiar with Lilienthal as the founder of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, one of the most important New Deal development programs. Lilienthal comes to Iran in the late 1950s with dreams of recreating the TVA in the deserts of Khuzestan, in the southwestern province of Iran. He works for years on plans to build hydroelectric dams, to build an Iranian petrochemical industry. He wants to use water for dams to irrigate Iranian crops. He has this very ambitious idea of how to modernize Iran along the lines of the TVA. And the book has an entire chapter dedicated to Lilienthal's efforts. Unfortunately, they don't succeed quite as he imagined, but I'll leave you in suspense as to that. You'll have to read the book to find out. Finally, the final theme. So I've discussed the theme of global oil and local development. The final theme of the book is the U.S. relationship with Iran on an official level. What kind of relationship did the United States have with Iran in the early Cold War? And where did oil and development fit in? Well, the United States really comes into Iran during the 1940s. There, of course, had been Americans who came to Iran in earlier periods. There had been missionaries, diplomats, businessmen. But the substantive engagement that the United States has with Iran really starts during World War II. And it's not often acknowledged that Iran was actually invaded and occupied during World War II. In 1941, in August of 41, British and Soviet armies invade Iran and place it under occupation, primarily to expedite the movement of supplies from the Persian Gulf to the Eastern Front. So Iran is under occupation for about 5 years, from 41 to 46. And during this period, U.S. Technical advisors come to Iran. They try to assist with the country's reconstruction. The United States becomes very concerned with Iranian affairs, Iran's security. They become very concerned with the stability of the Shah's government. The Shah, who I've included a photo of here from his trip to the United States in November 1949, you can see, I mean, he's in his late 20s in the late 40s. He became Shah in 41, and he was 21 years old. So from the perspective of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, the Shah seemed to be an essentially well-meaning, pro-Western, but inexperienced leader, one who needed support and assistance from the United States. But the most important lens to view the US relationship with Iran really is the lens of the Cold War. The United States was overwhelmingly concerned with Iran's strategic significance. In 1946, there is a crisis in Iran in the northern province of Azerbaijan. Soviet troops refuse to leave the province. Stalin actually tries to hold out to get an oil concession inside Iran. He doesn't get it. And eventually the Soviet troops leave. But the crisis in Azerbaijan really accelerates US concerns about Iran as a state which is on the front lines of the global Cold War. Iran shares a 1,500-mile-long border with the Soviet Union. It appears from a US perspective to be a weak country, a vulnerable country. I've already alluded to some of the concerns that US officials had about Iran. They thought it was economically backward. They thought the Shah was a relatively weak ruler. They felt that the government was mired by corruption. And they were overwhelmingly concerned with the threat of losing Iran to communism. This appears throughout US documents from this earlier period. But of course, oil is another very important part of how the United States views Iran. Iran was itself a major oil producer. In the post-war period, after the Azerbaijan crisis in 46-47, the United States is becoming increasingly concerned with facilitating the flow of oil from the major oil fields of the Middle East to major consuming markets in Western Europe and Japan. Middle East oil plays an incredibly important role in the Marshall Plan, the economic reconstruction of Western Europe. So Iran has an important role to play as a source of oil for post-war economic reconstruction. But there's also a bit of early domino theory at play here. I mentioned that the US thought of Iran as a very weak, vulnerable state. There was concern that were Iran to fall to communism, that would then lead to the fall of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, that eventually, were Iran to fall, the oil resources of the Persian Gulf would be lost entirely. So this was the key US concern. If we lose Iran, we may lose the entire region, and the oil of that region as well. So the key question from the United States' point of view is, how do we strengthen the Shah? How do we support the Shah? He's the only figure that seems capable of acting as a US ally. And a great deal of emphasis has been placed on the Shah's concern with military affairs, his sort of one-on-one engagements with various US presidents. He's Shah from 41 to 79, so he has relationships with half a dozen presidents. So there's a great deal of emphasis placed on that in existing histories, but I focus on what I see to be the most important element of this dynamic, which is the US concern for economic development in Iran. You have many US officials over the course of this entire period, and presidents as well, consistently saying, we can give weapons and aid to the Shah, but that's a short-term solution. The long-term solution is seeing the Shah organize and execute a detailed program of economic development to raise the Iranian people out of poverty, to improve the living conditions, particularly in rural areas, to modernize the country, to strengthen it internally, and that will provide the best safeguard to the spread of communist influence. This was key to the US thinking in this period. You have to try to motivate, you have to try to push the Shah towards economic development. And that's also where the work of these American NGOs are coming from. The Ford Foundation, the World Bank, other organizations, they're thinking with a Cold War mindset. They're thinking with how to help the Shah ward off the specter of communism. So the Cold War lens is very important to understanding this dynamic, but it's also important to grapple with these questions of oil and economic development. And finally, to shill my concept one last time, I build this into an emphasis on the dual integration of oil in Iran as the key way to understand US policy. From a US perspective, it was crucially important that Iran produced oil, that it sold oil on the global market, and that oil produced wealth, which the Shah could then use to fund his programs of economic development. And that's an important through line throughout this entire period. And it's also the way that we can explain some of the more important US policies that are undertaken during this period. The most important one, of course, being the coup of 1953. The US supports the overthrow of Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah in 1953 for several different reasons. But I argue in my book, Petroleum in Progress, and also in my second book, The Struggle for Iran, the most important reason that the United States overthrew Mossadegh was to restart the flow of Iranian oil. Not just to benefit the global oil economy and Western consumers, but also to restart the flow of oil wealth that Iran could use, that the Shah could use to strengthen the country, to provide internal reform, internal strengthening, and stability, and ward off the specter of communism. So, in a sense, the United States plays a very active, very engaged role in the creation of the Pahlavi petro-state. So I believe that brings me to the end of my slides. Here's the book again. I encourage you all to pick up a copy, and I think I'll end there. And I will say these books are works of history, but in my current position at Eurasia Group, I focus predominantly on contemporary Iran, contemporary US-Iranian relations, or issues of Iran in global geopolitics. So I welcome any questions pertaining to those issues, as well as the issues engaged in the book. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
I'm going to let Greg call on his own questions, but if I could also remind you, when you raise your hand, we'll bring a mic to you. And that's really important, not only so everybody can hear, but also because the mic funnels into our taping systems. That means that your words will be recorded for posterity. And who doesn't want that? So.
Okay, I think we had a question in the back right here, this gentleman right back here. I'll come out here so you can see all of me.
Hi, Dr. Brew. Good evening. It was a wonderful presentation, by the way. Very interesting. My question was about, you referenced the Ford Foundation and the IMF in a very altruistic manner. And I'm curious, do you think they would have been in Iran if they were that broccoli instead of oil? Thanks.
That's a great question. The Ford Foundation, I spent a long time in the Foundation's archives, which are up in Tarrytown in New York. They're at an old Rockefeller mansion, I think. And the funny thing about the Foundation is that very often the officers, the officials who work for the Foundation, they do seem to have, if not an altruistic, then at the very least a technocratic approach to issues of modernization and issues of, really what they're most interested in is going into the countryside and helping villages, helping the poorest, most impoverished people improve their quality of life. They're absolutely thinking with a Cold War mindset, right? They're thinking like, we're doing the work of the United States supporting these people so that they don't go communist. That's always there. That's always present. But to the oil question, Iran is seen as an important country and a country worthy of focus and attention. Oil is part of that. Iran's strategic significance next to the Soviet Union is another part of that. But I wouldn't say that they were there because of the oil. I mean, the Ford Foundation spends, in this period, they spent about $10 million in Iran to support several different missions. They spend over $100 million in India, which has no oil, but is also an important country, right, for different reasons. I will, however, say this. When Mossadegh comes to power in 1951 and nationalizes the oil industry, the Foundation had been sort of thinking about launching a program in Iran in 49-50. They hold off. They don't do anything. When Mossadegh falls in August of 1953 and the Shah returns, within days the Foundation is there, talking about setting something up, talking about launching a new program. So they absolutely thought the Shah was a more worthy figure to work with, as opposed to a secular, liberal, nationalist like Mossadegh, who didn't happen to have the sort of same Cold War mindset that the Shah did. So I would say from this perspective, the Cold War matters perhaps even more than the presence of oil. But oil is there, absolutely. It's always there. Yes, EJ. I can try passing it to him here. There you go.
You mentioned that the Kennedy administration was very close to the Shah's government, but to my understanding, Kennedy entered office very critical of U.S. policy towards the Pahlavi regime and tries to sideline him early on in the administration in favor of Prime Minister Amini. So why does that project fail? Why does he kind of come back to the Shah's government? And does it vindicate the idea that autocracy in Iran was a necessary evil?
It's a very, very good question, and it's one that the book engages with very carefully, because this, you're correct. Kennedy comes to office in '61. In his administration, figures of his administration, members of his administration, have very critical views of the Shah. And they support Ali Amini as a reforming prime minister who can come in '61 and try to lead Iran in a different direction. There is support for that. What the book argues, however, is that while there are members of the Kennedy administration who support that, there are other members of the administration who continue to support the Shah. That there is an ongoing dialogue within the US government between this idea of the Shah as an unreliable, really unsustainable autocrat, and also this idea that he's the best we got. That he's really the only one that the US can support because the alternatives are all worse. And that's the view that eventually wins out. I argue in the book, there's a very specific memo from Dean Rusk in '63. Rusk, who had sort of been on the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, who had been on the fence in this debate within the administration. And Rusk comes out and says, in the midst of the White Revolution, he says, it doesn't matter if the Shah succeeds or fails at this revolution. He is the only person we can support. And we have limited means of supporting reform inside Iran. If reform is going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from the Shah. We can't enter the country and try to engineer it from the inside. All we can really do is support the Shah and hope for the best. And that's really what the United States decides to do for the remainder of the Shah's reign. I mean, they talk to the Shah, they try to push him towards reform, but as Iran grows wealthier, as the Shah grows more powerful, the ability of US officials to influence his policies wanes, and they recognize the waning of that influence. Does that answer your question? This gentleman right here.
Thank you, Gregory. Please help me with my understanding of history. I noticed the picture of Truman with Mossadegh. Is my correct recollection that the British approached Truman and said they wanted his help to overthrow Mossadegh, and he threw him out of his office, and then a few years later, and I didn't hear Eisenhower's name come up, but it was Eisenhower that agreed to it.
No, yeah, this is, the intricacies of the coup are fascinating, and they feature in both books. I would stress that the other book, The Struggle for Iran, the red one, not the black one, gets at this specifically, because it's a history of the crisis and the coup. But to address your question, yes, the British, who had been in Iran for decades, had been deeply involved in Iranian affairs, hated Mossadegh and wanted him gone. And they wanted him gone from day one. The Americans didn't have that position. The Americans, their position on Mossadegh was much more complicated. But they do. They go to Truman in the fall of '52, and they say, we need to remove Mossadegh because he's leading Iran towards communism. And the Truman administration, their response to that is, possibly, you might be right. We're not sure about Mossadegh. He doesn't seem very reliable. He's not a communist. And because the Shah appears to be so weak and so vulnerable and so indecisive, and also, in the nuance of the time, the Shah had been sidelined within Iranian politics in late 1952. So from the US perspective, this British idea, you can remove Mossadegh, who do you replace him with? That was their fundamental problem. The fundamental problem of the Truman administration. The only way we can resolve this oil crisis is by cutting a deal with Mossadegh. Because he is, for all of his problems, for all of his faults, he is probably the most reasonable, the most powerful figure who isn't a communist inside Iran. So the Truman administration does. They say no to the British coup plan. There had been an American coup plan in the works in the CIA around the same time. So what happens is the Truman administration leaves in early '53, the Eisenhower administration comes in, and initially they have the same position. Mossadegh is the best we got. There are political events inside Iran in February of '53 that change this assessment. There is a long-running negotiation to resolve the nationalization crisis, which falls apart in February of '53. That changes the assessment. The specific reason why the Eisenhower administration changes their view on a coup is still a little unclear because we don't have a quote-unquote smoking gun. But we do have a lot of documents that suggest that by March of '53, the administration saw the situation evolving in such a way that if they did nothing, Mossadegh would eventually fall and would be replaced by someone worse. So in that perspective, in that situation, the administration's plan was, let's remove Mossadegh and replace him with the Shah while we still have the ability to do so, right? So it was really, the coup was an action undertaken for fear of doing nothing. If they did nothing, the situation would spiral out of control. There is a certain amount of discontinuity between Truman and Eisenhower, but my assessment in both of the books is that there's quite a lot of continuity in how they approach the situation. The situation itself seems to change, so their views change along with it. I will stress that there are people like Allen Dulles who wanted Mossadegh gone from day one. And of course, he's CIA director for Eisenhower, so he has a little bit more sway. But Eisenhower himself, Foster Dulles, Beadle Smith, they have more nuanced positions. They have to be convinced that a coup is necessary. And by February '53, they see it as the only alternative. Yes, sir.
Great talk. My questions are not truly about Iran, but I would like to hear your thoughts on Venezuela. Is there any parallel in Venezuelan oil development as far as U.S. interest is concerned? I mean, with the previous democracy. So maybe it's a future project for you, but I'm just curious. Another follow-up question is, if I remember correctly, Biden, even wanted the current dictator to try to go there and try to have them restart the oil.
In Venezuela?
Yeah, in Venezuela. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, Venezuela has many parallels. There is, just as there is quite an elaborate, quite well-established oil history of Iran, there's a very, very broad scholarship on the development of the Venezuelan petro-state, if you like, because Venezuela has many similarities. It's a state where oil is discovered fairly early in the 1920s. It has a tremendous amount of oil. It has, I believe, the world's largest proven reserves. And it undergoes some sort of similar stages where development becomes skewed by oil production, the economy becomes dependent upon oil exports. This supports various forms of authoritarianism at different points. I will stress that Venezuela was also a democracy at various points of history. Iran has had less success at democratic politics, I'll put it like that. So as far as parallels, absolutely. The US involvement in Venezuela is very different. Because there were periods where the US saw Venezuela as an ally, it saw Venezuela as a partner. What it predominantly saw Venezuela as in this period was a major source of oil for the Western Hemisphere. So the problem that they kept having with the Middle East was, the Middle East has the largest reserves of oil in the world at this time, but the oil is in vulnerable countries that are very close to the Soviet Union, that are struggling with internal problems. Venezuela appeared to be somewhat safer as a source of crude oil. So the degree of US involvement in Venezuela, in this period at least, is, I would say, quite a bit less and of a different variety. But there are certainly parallels. To your second point about restarting, Chevron, I know, is very, very interested in trying to get things up and going in Venezuela. But from what I understand, progress on that front has been fairly minimal, just because of not just the presence of US sanctions or US policy towards the Maduro government, but the fact that Venezuela's oil industry has now gone for such a long period of time without sufficient investment, and it's in sort of a sorry state of repair. So to increase your Venezuelan oil production exports, you would need to spend quite a bit of money, and finding that money might be tough. That's just my understanding. I'm sure there are people who can speak to it in greater detail. I hope I answered your question. Anyone over here? I don't want to prioritize these folks. Yes? It's okay to go to the left. It is, as ever.
You talked about a gulf between the Shah and his elites and the population. Was that something that grew gradually over time to the point of bursting in 79? And was that paralleled by a similar growth in his investment of oil dollars in the military?
That's a good question. One of the themes that I emphasize in the book is a fairly strong degree of continuity in how a lot of particularly US observers and officials view the Shah, but also a degree of continuity in how the Shah's sort of system of government is viewed. The Shah, I mean, as far as having a base of support within Iran's population, it never really gets beyond the military, the central bureaucracy, and certain portions of the elite. I mean, when you talk about figures or political movements in this period that have sort of mass political support, right, very obvious bodies of support within the Iranian population, Mossadegh would be one. He was tremendously popular. The Tuda party, the Communist Party that was active for a time, was able to enjoy some support, but the Shah always struggled at developing a coherent domestic political base of support throughout his entire reign, really, because he refused to enact any kind of really substantive political reform, right? He was always very worried about the middle class, because that was Mossadegh's main constituency. The Iranian peasantry, the Iranian sort of rural class, was never particularly politically involved, even right before the revolution. The revolution predominantly happens inside major cities. So the Shah, and because of this lack of reform and because of this sort of insecurity that the Shah feels, most of his attentions, most of his support is built within the military apparatus and the central state bureaucracy. And those are really his major focuses. Those are really his major bases of support early in his reign and towards the very end. As far as a gulf forming, I mean, there are intelligence assessments from the late 50s, sort of a few years after the coup, where CIA and State Department officials interview Iranians and try to get a sense of the Iranian political attitude. And the most prominent feature, the most prominent emotion is apathy. This sense that, like, this government isn't ours, the Shah is, he's retaining power through coercive methods, he doesn't have a coherent basis of support. So it's already present in the 50s. And of course it becomes very vocally, very expressively enforced during the revolutionary years of the late 1970s. But it's a problem that the Shah struggles with throughout his entire reign.
Is there a tipping point?
Yes, the tipping point comes in 76. Iran enjoys sort of runaway economic growth after the oil crisis of 73. But by 76, it's struck with a fall in the price of oil, a relative fall in the price of oil. By that point, it's been struggling with rampant inflation and growing budget deficits. Because even with all the wealth they're generating, the Shah is never able to balance his budget. He's always trying to spend more. So 76 is something of an economic tipping point. But 76 is also the moment where Khomeini and the other sort of Islamist figures are starting to develop more organized support in the country. Like they're constructing a political organization, right? They're having meetings, they're developing systems of organization. So by 77, there are organized protests, there's a coherent political opposition forming, which hadn't been present in previous years, primarily through the work of Khomeini and his allies. The other problem by 77 is that the Shah is dying. He has cancer. And he is displaying a lot of the indecision that US officials criticize him for in the 50s and 60s. He's unable to make a really concrete policy decision. He's constantly waffling between repressing the protests, trying to stifle them through military action, while also offering sort of piecemeal reforms, releasing prisoners, this sort of thing. So the Shah isn't able to cope with the situation and eventually has to leave. Isn't able to hold on.
Greg, I think we have time for one more question.
One more question. Right over here. Yes, Professor Ron.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for that talk. So if I'm understanding you, reading you correctly, maybe through the lines a bit, the Shah is unable to build a base of support with the middle class, in part because of his role in replacing Mossadegh, who was their guy. He then so he uses, and so in your story, there's this dual integration which fails in a sense because the money is not really being channeled into sort of widespread economic development, but to building up the Shah's personal power in the military and the bureaucracy. But in there, you also talked about the White Revolution, which I either recall from talking with you or from somewhere else, where it has something to do with an attempt at like land reform in the countryside. So, so here it sounds like an attempt to build the social base that he needs in the countryside. And I'm going to take a guess at why this, I presume, does not quite succeed as desired. Tell me if I get it right. So you can't do real land reform in the countryside because of the power of the landlords or the powerful rural groups. And you certainly can't do it without the support of the middle class, which he does not have. But without doing actual real land reform in the country, all the old problems continue to persist, and the modernization can never really go through. Is that about right?
Yeah, pretty much. The White Revolution is a land reform campaign, but it's mostly a program to eliminate the landed aristocracy as a political class. So the White Revolution breaks apart the largest estates, eliminates them essentially as economic units. The aristocrats, the landowners, are very generously compensated with various sort of tokens of largesse. They're given shares in new industrial companies, etc. Lots of sort of handouts from the Shah's government to placate them as they're being eliminated as a political class. There is an idea that, this will allow the Shah to develop support among the peasantry. But the thing is that they don't follow it through. Land reform is essentially reversed in '66 and replaced with forms of sort of mass corporate farming. There's an attempt to sort of accelerate mechanization of farming. The practical results being Iranian agricultural output crashes, and there's a mass migration of agricultural labor towards the cities where all the industry is happening. So the Shah eliminates the aristocrats on purpose, but also eliminates the peasantry sort of by accident, and is left with a mass of now underemployed, urban dwelling but rural raised Iranians who don't have any connection with his modernization reforms, who have no interest in westernization, who really, if they feel identity with anything, it's Iranian nationalism and Islam. And a sense of alienation with the government that is sort of running their lives. And this is the primary base of support that Khomeini and the Islamist movement is able to tap into, is this mass of underemployed, formerly agrarian and now industrial labor that has moved to the cities. So land reform succeeds as a political program, insofar as it eliminates the aristocracy. But I argue in the book, and US officials argue as well, that as an economic program, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
I lied. I have one more question. So we're a presidential history center, and obviously we've been thinking a lot about President Carter of late for sad but obvious reasons. And I predict that when he finally passes, the public is going to see something that has been going on within the historical community for some time, which is a more positive reassessment of his presidency than the public perceives. Now, when I say more positive, of course, remember, everybody thinks it was terrible. So more positive means only slightly terrible. But I wonder if you could reassess or what your thoughts are on Carter's relationship with Iran, which of course is central to how we remember his presidency, and in particular his handling of the hostage crisis. Because I think there's a case to be made that he didn't handle it well, but that he also didn't handle it poorly, in that war did not break out, violence did not break out. What's your assessment of his overall handling of the crisis?
I'm going to waffle a bit because I hope to write a book about it at some point, and I'm still thinking it through. But my assessment at the moment is this, is that Carter identifies that the Shah is done in November of '78, several months before the Shah leaves. The Carter administration realizes the Shah's position is unsustainable. And Carter makes, I think, the correct strategic choice to essentially abandon the Shah, because to have supported the Shah continually past that point would have been to escalate the situation inside Iran. And then, the Shah leaves in January, Khomeini returns in February, and then there's about 7 months where the US isn't really sure how to proceed with Iran. Like, what do we do with this Islamist government? We know they're not communist. We know they don't like the Soviet Union. Maybe we can work with these guys. Maybe there's something, Iran was our strongest supporter, our strongest ally. Maybe there's some kind of modus vivendi. Obviously, the hostage crisis in November of '79 makes that essentially impossible. Carter then makes the extremely poor decision in April of 1980 to try to rescue the hostages with a military intervention that fails. Dramatic. It fails even before it begins. This is the infamous Operation Eagle Claw, where the helicopters collide with one another in the desert and are found by an Iranian schoolboy who immediately alerts the militia who come and take photographs of it, and it's a complete disaster. And obviously that was a very, very poor choice. But the thing to remember about Carter and the hostage crisis is that Carter ultimately succeeds in getting the hostages home. The negotiations that start in November 1980, as Carter is proceeding to lose the White House, end in success in January 1981. The hostages are released. Famously, they come home the day after Reagan is inaugurated, which lots of people read into that. Lots of people think like, oh, the Iranians waited until Carter was out of office. But ultimately, the negotiations that were begun by Carter's team, that were passed through mediation in Algeria, they eventually did succeed in ending the crisis. And as you say, averting war and averting an even worse, more general conflagration. So I think there are ways to assess more positively Carter's role vis-a-vis Iran. But the problem is that Carter was faced with a scenario that every US president since Roosevelt had faced in some way, this idea that the Shah was going to collapse. Every single White House, from Roosevelt to Carter, had members of it who said, at some point the Shah is going to fall. This is not sustainable. At some point, his regime is going to crumble, and we're going to have to figure out what to do. And every single one just kind of just kicks the can down the road and says, well, he's the best we got. And it's Carter where everything falls apart, and not necessarily for reasons that have to do with Carter's own policy. And he faces an impossible situation and handles it probably as well as any administration could have.
Well, I think this contributes to the overall theory that the most important thing of success or failure for any president is the times that they are president.
Yeah.
That I would challenge, that I would suggest no president would have been successful in the late 1970s. Not even George Washington. Especially, he would have been befuddled by so many things.
He would have been confused.
Yeah. In any event, we are not befuddled by how much we appreciate Greg Brew coming back, so join me. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will actually be a discussion of Carter's successor, Ronald Reagan.
Hey, applause for Reagan.